Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we are back with another interview. This time, we're going to be talking about the warming planet and what we can do about it. Earth is warming. The oceans are becoming more acidified, and extreme weather is becoming the norm. The Earth's natural capacity to capture and process CO2 was overrun by humanity's appetite for growth in 1970. Today, Earth Overshoot Day, when we exceed the planet's carrying capacity, arrives in July. We need to move that back not just to December 31st, but well into the next year so that we're leaving something for the rest of the species on the planet and the health of the entire environment for the future. Our guest today, Wake Smith, is a lecturer on climate interventions at Yale and a senior fellow at the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Business and Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. His newly revised book, Pandora's Toolbox, The Hopes and Hazards of Climate Intervention, explores where we are with regard to the climate crisis today and the various strategies and technologies that can be used to end CO2 emissions and restore the planet to pre-industrial climate conditions. It's going to take generations, but we need to make meaningful steps today. We'll provide links to find Pandora's Toolbox in the article accompanying this podcast, and I encourage you to take a look. It's a fascinating read, and it's going to leave you with plenty of questions to ponder. Welcome to the show, Wake. How are you?
I'm great and happy to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you, and it's good to talk with you from Seattle because I know you are a former resident. Welcome back virtually.
Thank you. It brings back fond memories. It's a great place.
Well, we're trying to keep it that way. Now, your book does a great job of explaining the climate predicament in detail. What I wanted to start off by asking you is, what do you think the path to net zero will look like to people following the news over the next 30 years? Are we on track to hit net zero in 2030 or 2050, excuse me? Or
not even close.
Okay.
The path will look like two steps forward and one step back, if even that much. It's going to be a much slower path than people realize. There's a lot of naive optimism now that this will be easy and quick, and it won't be.
Well, what will those steps forward start to look like? What are the kinds of news events that you're going to be looking for as somebody who analyzes the progress we're making? Are you looking for technological breakthroughs? Are you looking for policy breakthroughs? What do events in the future look like?
We need those things and others. This is a problem that won't be solved with a silver bullet. We need lots of silver buckshot. Mm-hmm. So, but we certainly do need technological breakthroughs. If getting to net zero is painful for people, if it requires lots of sacrifice, I'm afraid people aren't going to be very enthusiastic about doing it. And so one of the things that is likely to pace our path to net zero is how quickly we can develop new technologies that make the transition to net zero nearly free. And then people will sacrifice a little to do it. But if we're really asking people to sacrifice a lot in ways that they feel, I'm afraid the world isn't yet to a point where I think most people will vote for that. Brave Europe is doing some of that, but we're not doing much of that in the U.S.
Now, you actually use a date in 2083 in your book where you describe the world celebrating net zero. Why is that what you think the ballpark range is?
It is something like that. It's much closer to that than it is to 2050. Mm-hmm. I have a particular set of assumptions that I used to arrive at that date. So that date isn't meant to be a solid prediction. It's more nearly what a reasonable ballpark might look like. But I'm in my mid-60s now. We won't see net zero in my lifetime, no matter how long I live. Again, this is going to prove to be more difficult than people realize, in part because the path to net zero is not a luge-like plunge where we're all pulling in the same direction. It's a tug of war between opposing forces. Mm-hmm. And P.S., we now have a real hot war that has broken out here in Europe where I am today, that ain't going to help either. To the extent that we hereafter try to ruin Russia's economy with sanctions, which is what we're now talking about doing, I don't imagine Russia as a petro state is going to be very cooperative with us about seeking to solve the climate problem. So yet another reason that this may prove slower than we hope is not everybody may be pulling in the same direction.
Well, I'm sure of that. But, when I think back to the history of the transition from the horse to the car, the buggy makers and the buggy whip makers were dead set against the move. But eventually, the future won out because people chose the better option. And even in Russia, they are going to face some of the most extreme climate extreme climate consequences in the world. And it seems to me like Putin is really playing a very dangerous game for his own personal safety, because his people may get tired of his petrochemical war and simply toss him out, or at least we might hope so.
We might hope so. Putin himself, in his statements over the last couple of days, has made it clear he has no interest in or patience for democracy. He perceives democracy as a Western import that isn't right for Russia and the sphere of influence he seeks to carve out. But not to take us too far into that current event, the point is there will be lots of countries and companies and people whose interests are on the other side of the bread. They're not going. Saudi Arabia is not going to be eager to see us move beyond a fossil fuel economy, and neither is Wyoming or Texas. So there are lots of technological changes that need to take place. But if we need to get to net zero faster than the technology will make it easy to do, we're going to need lots of policy implementation as well. So this is the kind of big government that freedom-minded Americans are going to be reluctant to impose upon themselves.
So let's talk about what happens after net zero, because, of course, there's 2 centuries of excess CO2 and CO2 equivalents in the atmosphere already. And your book offers a lot of explanations about potential technologies for reducing that anthropogenic CO2 level. How long are our descendants going to be dealing with the consequences of the fossil fuel era?
A long time is the technical answer, by which I mean hard to predict that far into the future, but you've already set the expectation right. I think we count this in centuries or multiples of human lifetimes. The framing about climate that the world is finally buying into, the first framing it has ever really bought into, is this concept of net zero. Mm-hmm. And so net zero is a good concept because people seem to understand it and buy into it emotionally. And so we need to move to net zero as quickly as possible. But you're right that one of the key themes in my book, that is new in my book relative to other climate books, it's not new to science, but new to the understanding of the general public, is that when we get to net zero, particularly if I'm right that the path to net zero is slow, then net zero will not be the end of the climate problem, but merely the end of the beginning. We will thereafter, for centuries, deal with the consequences of the extent to which we've made the atmosphere a waste dump for our excess CO2. And the problem is that the natural drain by which the planet or the climate system removes that CO2 is, on a human timescale, essentially clogged. It will take centuries for, after net zero, for the climate system to reabsorb all of that CO2.
To digest all of our garbage.
That's exactly it. And so I worry that our descendants will look back on us with some amount of resentment over the fact that we couldn't control our consumption so as to avoid leaving them with a huge carbon debt that they will have to pay off.
It's interesting when you put it that way, because when we think about the historic grievances that still plague us, you've just described an entirely new dimension of grievance that is going to be applied to the past and to people who participated, or communities, like the different sides that you were describing earlier in the conversation. We may hold a lot of resentment towards various nations because they resisted this for longer. That's an interesting insight. I did not even thought of that before.
I worry that our grandchildren will not look upon us with the gratitude we might hope they might.
So let me ask this. There are a lot of different projections about how much we need to spend to get out of this. That is just to reach net zero. And McKinsey, for instance, estimates, and I think this is a very high estimate on the range, that we need to spend $9 trillion a year to move past this. How much do humans need to plan to spend to move out of the climate crisis? What percentage of GDP, for instance, and in what time frame?
Well, I'm sure not going to argue with McKinsey's number. So it has, as you say, reported that number, and that's a huge number. That's more than 10% of global production or economic output per year. Devoting that much to moving us to net zero would be an extraordinarily expensive endeavor that, once again, there isn't there isn't that level of urgency around this issue yet. People are willing to spend pennies, but they're not willing to spend 10% of global output. Moreover, once again, net zero, if it proves to be a slow path to net zero, won't be the end of the problem. And the reason for that, to resort to an analogy, is that one can think of our emissions problem as a bathtub. We've got a faucet flowing into the bathtub, and that's our ongoing flow of emissions out smokestacks and tailpipes. We've got the tub itself with a water level that is filling, and we've got a drain, which I've said on a human time scale is essentially clogged. Well, the problem is what informs the climate is not the flow of emissions coming out of the faucet. It's the water level of the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So even if we turn the spigot all the way off, the water isn't draining away. We've simply stopped filling the tub. And the generations after net zero then will have to deal with the consequences of that overfull tub. One thing that means is that the climate damages that will accrue in the century after net zero will be greater than those that accrued in the century before net zero.
And that's a key point, I think, that a lot of people tend to think, oh, then the temperature stops rising and whenever we hit net zero. In fact, because of the chemical characteristics of that greenhouse gas, the Earth is going to continue to absorb more solar energy and get warmer. The planet stores most of that energy in the oceans, which are getting warmer too, and then will keep the rest of the environment warmer. So we really do need to take a lot of steps, as you said, a silver buckshot, not a silver bullet, in order to just cut away at this at every possible way we can. Are there long-term economic benefits to making those investments in a post-carbon economy, do you think? Do they outweigh those short-term costs we were talking about?
Well, we get here into an intergenerational question. Mm-hmm. They don't outweigh them for we, the generation alive today that gets to enjoy a high consumption lifestyle and not pay for the climate damages we're causing to the future. On the other hand, the future would very much prefer that we undertake those expenditures today so that we don't saddle them with those consequences. So we quickly get into intergenerational ethical issues, and the ethics of all of this are terrible. We are exporting pain to the future for our economic benefit today, and yet everybody wishes to be a little richer, not a little poorer. Right. So your question was, will there be economic benefits to undertaking these climate investments? There will be for the future. There may not necessarily be for the present. All sorts of politicians try to spin it otherwise, and I wish, therefore, that it were true that investing in the climate green economy is going to be the source of jobs, not the not a sink of jobs. At minimum, it's going to be each, and more likely more of the latter than the former. What we essentially have to do is to start charging ourselves for the right to dump carbon into the air. That's a carbon tax. And one way or another, we very much need a carbon tax. It can be indirect by taxing companies instead of individuals, or it can be direct by taxing, we, the emitters ourselves, as we fill our gas tank at the pump or whatever. But one way or another, we've got to attach a cost to something that is now free, that virtually everybody in an industrial society does, which is to, in one way, directly or indirectly, create carbon emissions. And if we now have to charge for something that's free, that bites everybody a little bit.
It's interesting. We don't really think of the cost of our garbage that we send to the dump, although there's an immense cost to that. And we have shouldered that. It's simply time to recognize that we have another dump that we need to pay for.
All of that's true, but few people recognize the carbon cost of free 2-day delivery of everything. And your hometown behemoth company, Amazon, has created this expectation that you can get anything free. And I know someone who is planning a wedding who ordered 10 different dresses, only one of which she intends to keep. The other 9 she'll return. But all of that delivery activity is, quote, free. Well, it ain't free to the carbon, to the carbon cycle. There's lots of carbon expended in all of that free delivery and free shipping. And it's a wonderful convenience. Don't get me wrong. But it comes at a carbon price like lots of things do.
Well, we can hope that they decarbonize and that everybody decarbonizes. But let me ask this question, which is pressing based on everything we've just said. Is the world governable during the climate crisis based on the systems that we have today?
No.
What new institutions do we need?
I don't know, but none of this is governable by the existing institutions, starting simply with mitigation or the reduction of emissions. Mm-hmm. The Paris Agreement is the very best bit of diplomacy in the climate arena that the world has ever invented. It's failing. It ain't doing doodly yet. Now, by that, I mean emissions are still rising. COVID aside, we reduced emissions in 2020 by wrecking the economy with a pandemic, but we hope wrecking the economy is not the path to net zero. But emissions are rising again. The expectation is that in 2022 they will likely be higher than they were in 2019. So we haven't yet turned the corner on emissions, and therefore even the noble Paris Agreement isn't yet proving to have the governance impact we need it to have. Negative emissions technologies, either before or after net zero, sucking carbon out of the air and burying it in the ground, that too will require enormous one world government in order to raise the funds to do that and pay the people who are doing it. We don't have governance institutions sufficiently empowered to do that either. And if we get onto solar radiation management, which we must do at some point in this conversation, there too we don't have a governance structure that would be appropriate to that intervention. So in all of the big things we can do in the climate arena, other than local adaptations, where we do have the governance infrastructure to build a seawall across the Verrazano Narrows in New York, or protect Puget Sound from floods, we can do that. We have the governance institutions to do that, but the governance necessary to do the rest of the climate, solve the rest of the climate problem, is currently beyond our grasp.
So you anticipated where I was going with that question. And you make the claim in the book that our descendants are going to demand climate intervention, that they're going to want to see us cool the planet using, in particular, you call out stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI. And that involves spraying sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere to deflect the sun's energy. It's pretty controversial. It's very controversial. This form of geoengineering is something that scares a lot of the environmental community. I'm very concerned about it myself. you just hit on the fact that we don't have a way to govern those climate interventions at all. Can we prevent individual agents and nations from acting unilaterally? I don't think we can.
Maybe we can. We've got to go into a couple of nuances. If we're talking about preventing a country from trying to reduce sunlight over the entire globe, I think the world will find ways to prevent that. It would affect the world of the climate of the entire globe. And even if Russia or China or the US, for that matter, started a military superpower started to undertake this, I do think the world would find ways to prevent a military superpower from trying to do that. Although I'm not certain about that. That's the way to bet. But if Vladimir Putin 80 years from now were darned, determined to start messing with the atmosphere, are we going to go to war over that? But it isn't realistic that an individual does this, or a little country does this, or a company does this. This is way bigger than any of that. And so I do think this likely flows into global arenas somehow.
It's interesting that your comment about that, not a company or an individual. There's a new book by Neil Stephenson, the science fiction author, called Termination Shock, in which he envisions several individuals, very wealthy individuals, who are primarily interested in protecting their low-lying real estate, start to do SAI. And there is a form of war, I won't get into it, but that involves those regions that are negatively impacted by the intervention trying to stop the intervention. And it really raised for me a lot of interesting questions about what does conflict look like? Because most conflict ends up contributing to the climate problem too. And if nuclear war, then it's not a climate problem at all because there's no climate left. So if this is inevitable that we need to do these interventions, what are the downsides of the interventions we need to be aware of with SAI?
Well, let me first quibble with the predicate a little bit. I don't think SAI is inevitable. I do think climate interventions are inevitable, and specifically the intervention that is unavoidable, in my view, is big negative emissions technologies, not trees, but big machines all over the world. Carbon capture and sequestration in the crust of the earth, not in the biosphere. So not trees, carbon capture. I think that is absolutely inevitable. I just don't think we're going to solve the climate problem fast enough to avoid that. As regards SAI, on the other hand, I think it is very likely that the world will want some method of managing sunlight, because it may just get too hot. And by too hot, I don't merely mean that you and I will need to buy another air conditioner. I mean that large parts of the globe near the equator may no longer be suitable for agriculture, and you may have hundreds of millions of climate refugees leaving their homelands trying to go to Siberia where it's warm. Holy cow. And if we have problems on that scale, then the world may be desperate for ways to manage sunlight. But we don't currently know if anything works. And so it may well prove to be that SAI is just a bad idea. And I'm totally open to that scientific conclusion.
Yeah, and please let me be clear. I don't think you're an advocate for it. I think that you're explaining it. But you do make several statements that it seems to be inevitable. You spend a lot of time on it. So that's why I asked. But I do see this difference between carbon capture and SAI. That carbon capture can actually have an economic benefit, because not just storing it in the ground, but the material that you can capture, the CO2 that can be broken down into carbon to make things, not just fuel. And we've had a number of interviews with folks on the show about that as well. But both of these represent potential moral hazards, in that you could turn on this system, a kind of a global air conditioner of carbon capture systems, or SAI, or the combination of them, and justify continuing to emit. Do you see that as a potential threat?
Yes and no, in that order. It will be rational to do some amount of carbon capture instead of stopping some emissions, because some emissions may be so difficult to stop that it's cheaper to offset them with carbon capture than to prevent them, such as methane release from rice paddies. Well, we're not going to tell people to stop making rice. People need this to eat. And so that's a sort of emission aviation going to be very difficult to decarbonize. We need to do that eventually too, but that will be late in the game. And so there are some emissions where, again, it will be easier to continue that type of emission and offset it with negative emissions. And I don't see any moral hazard in that. Those are equivalent trade-offs.
And those are the basis for policy too, because you have clear costs and benefits, and you can say, we're doing it for this reason and this very gated reason, rather than we're just doing it.
Yep. Whereas with SAI, I think what people who know what it is at all, and there aren't very many, it's a very niche bit of knowledge, but those people who know much about it fear that it will be an excuse to prevent the mitigation of emissions. I think that's just not very likely. In part because we can't do SAI for decades, even if we wanted to. We don't know how to do it. We don't know where to do it. We don't have the aircraft by which to do it. Again, it's a huge intervention. If done well, it would need to be done all over the world, Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere, at various latitudes. And so it would require an alliance of loads of countries. It would take, we're not going to do this in the first half of this century. And it's in the first half of this century that we need to make huge progress on decarbonization. So just time-wise, these two things don't line up. I think that firstly, we've got to prove SAI is a good idea at all, and it may not be. And then we've got to set up a system by which to govern it, which will take a long time. And we've got to figure out how to do it well, which will take a long time. But the circumstance in which we might implement this in 2080 or 2100 is this circumstance where tens of millions of people are dying and hundreds of millions due to heat waves and other climate impacts, and livestock are dying in their fields because of wet bulb temperature spikes. In that world, is it a risk worth taking? Well, maybe. It's sure worth researching today whether it's a good idea, so that those people in the future know whether this is a tool they should avail themselves with or not. So to make clear a point we were on earlier, I'm not an advocate of deployment. I'm absolutely an advocate of research into this and other techniques by which we might be able to manage sunlight in the future if that proves to be necessary. If we ever do this, most of it we will do after net zero.
We have a lot to do just to get to net zero. That's an excellent point. So we've talked about the fact that we need a price on carbon. We've talked about various forms of intervention. What should our listeners be thinking about supporting when they hear these ideas? Are there other major themes that you would suggest that people start to pay attention to beyond those topics?
We're in an era when companies and countries are setting bold net zero pledges, not connected to effective action by which to get to them. And so I'm afraid that later in this decade, we're going to begin to see the lines diverge, the one line being where we pledged we were going to go and another line where our emissions are going. But we do need to support net zero pledges by companies and by countries. We need a policy by which to get to net zero in the U.S., and we need to support that. That was a big part of the Build Back Better bill, which of course is stalled in Congress. And there were lots of other things in that bill that one may or may not be in favor of. But the spending on climate that was built into that bill was super important for this goal. We will need to invest heavily public funds into technological development to try to speed this transition. We will need to improve our power grid. People are currently excited and, in my view, overly excited about the impact of solar and wind and the degree to which those are penetrating the power market. Don't get me wrong; those are good things. We need all of that we can get. But the proportion of the world's primary energy supply that derives from fossil fuels has not changed in my lifetime. It has not changed since the beginning, since the automobile industry was invented. Still today, despite the growth of wind and solar, more than 80% of the world's primary energy supply derives from fossil fuels. And so we haven't yet begun to make a big dent in that.
So the other, you tell a great story near the end of the book about asking your Yale class, who of course are very concerned about this. They're taking classes in climate intervention. What they should do, what ideas they have about how to change their personal consumption in order to discourage the continued emission of CO2. And nobody had an answer.
It didn't appear people had even thought of the question.
So how do we get people to think of that?
Well, I don't know. It is difficult. We're back into the ethical terrain here, which is terrible. But everybody imagines that somebody else is responsible for solving the climate problem. Mm-hmm. So it isn't that my students were silent. It's that all of the fingers they wanted to point were outward, not inward. Right. So they wanted to excoriate Exxon. They wanted to get Yale University to divest carbon stocks. They wanted to cheer on Greta Thunberg and vote for a different congressman. But nobody was talking about giving up the summer internship in Europe that they just won because it would take too long to get there and back by boat. Nope. Nobody had gone to their dorm and turned the heat down in order to make it a little cooler in the dorm. We're not yet grasping that this will require lifestyle changes. And it's difficult to grasp that. After all, nobody wants the sucker's share. Nobody wants to be the one who sacrifices while everybody else doesn't sacrifice. Yep. It is a huge collective action problem. And so we do need to find ways to have our government take action. But there are also personal actions. So, to the end of that story was driving home that night, I decided to give up beef. Now that's a ridiculous little. It's not going to move the meter on anything, but I at least have sacrificed something on the altar of climate change, something personal.
Well, it also sends a signal back into the system that says, I don't want that. And that is a potentially powerful lever if enough people do it. I have not given up meat or beef entirely. I admit that I still probably eat beef once a week. But I also frankly acknowledge I'm imperfect. And one of the things that has, I think, been a challenge early in this dialogue is that the perfect is the enemy of progress, because it's not enough. Well, okay, it isn't enough, but it is something. Do the kids in the class get that?
These are kids way smarter than I am, so I'm sure they do at some level. Yeah. But people weren't thinking of it in those terms. They weren't, by and large, thinking of personal sacrifices that they ought to make in the absence of government policy, and almost no one is. My business career was in the commercial aviation business, so I am certainly among those that helped create this climate problem in some sense. Have I given up flying because of its outsized role in my personal carbon footprint? It's so difficult.
Have you reduced it though? That's a step.
I have reduced it, in part because when I want to go somewhere, I now have a third bit of consideration that I'm putting on the scale. My questions used to be, do I have the time to do this? And do I have the money to do this? Those were the only criteria. And now I do have a third criterion, which is this of such importance to me that it's worth the carbon output? And again, if I were a better person, the answer to that question would always be no. I'm not quite that good a person yet, but I have cut down on just weekend trip to somewhere. Buying a smaller car, buying an electric vehicle, even though it costs more. There are all sorts of sacrifices that people can make personally, and they do reduce your happiness a little bit, and you do thereafter have some resentment of the guy driving past you in a pickup truck who doesn't use that for any industrial purpose. But we gotta start somewhere.
Exactly. And Wake, it's been a pleasure to talk, because you are talking about the thinking through where to start. And that is the critical thing for us to be doing today. And it's also what we try to do every day at Earth911. So thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
Well, you're very kind to have me. There's lots to talk about on this, and I am therefore happy to have opportunities to stand on my soapbox and sing a little bit.
Well, we would love to have you back again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Wake Smith. He's the author of Pandora's Toolbox, The Hopes and Hazards of Climate Intervention. Folks, this is a very important conversation, one that we all need to start having, not only with our friends and family, but with the people that we work with the companies that we work with, through our communication as a consumer. I do or do not want that thing because it has too much carbon involved in it. These are steps that we all can begin to embrace, but it's a little like creating your own philosophy or your own religion. We're on the path to a new way of valuing everything around us, and it's going to be an incredible journey. Also pretty perilous. And I think that the events in Ukraine this week are one example of that peril continuing to rise in a variety of different settings. But don't get too discouraged, because somehow this species does get through things. And I think we can do it again. It's just going to be tough. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. And on that happy note, I do want to tell you that I hope that you will come back and listen to the next show and share the other 270 or so that we have produced. Take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Folks, have a green day, and we'll be back soon.